Hello and welcome to another chat. This one's going to be about submarines that carry aircraft. Actually, it's a topic that came up in a Q&A that I did recently, and I thought it deserved a whole video on its own. There's actually a lot more submarines than you might think. I'm going to cover all of them chronologically. So I am H.I. Sutton. I'm a defense analyst, not a YouTuber as such. This is unscripted, unedited, just a guy talking, sharing what he knows. Let's get on with it. Start at the beginning, always a good place to start. U-12, a German submarine in 1915, that's during World War One, was the first submarine to ever carry an aircraft, as far as I know, almost certain. It's quite an interesting tale. It's the idea of this guy. That's a later photo of him, but on the right you can see the aircraft that they were using, the FF-29. He had a couple of float planes, two of them to be precise, in his squadron, and he wanted to do reconnaissance of Great Britain, England, so Kent, and his planes didn't really have the range, so he thought, I know, I will carry them closer to a target by submarine. Now, we might be tempted to think that the idea is that the submarine submerges, creeps up close to the shore, surfaces, and the float plane takes off. But of course, the float plane couldn't go underwater. So actually, not that at all. And it's not why they use submarines. The idea was that the submarine would run on the surface with the float plane. You could put them either before or after of the coning tower. That's the bit sticks up in the middle. There's photos of both. But sails along, and when it gets within range for the float plane to conduct its mission, the submarine begins to submerge and the float plane floats off the submarine. So the attraction of submarines was that they can submerge. That was the key. Not that they would be stealthy on the way to launch the aircraft. Of course, it's really important to get the order right. If you do submerge with the float plane still attached, then that's a definite no-no. You've lost your plane. So don't make that mistake. Here's a lovely photo of it behind the sail or the coning tower. Quite a quite a great photo. The Germans conducted only one mission. It was really only experimental. It's interesting. It clearly didn't work that well. They never repeated it. But the next year, the Royal Navy thought, hmm, that's an interesting idea. Let's do that. I actually don't know whether the Royal Navy even knew of the German mission, but they had a similar idea. But they were going to carry two aircraft, and they made much more greater modifications to the submarine. Their mission was a bit different. They weren't wanting to do reconnaissance flights. They were wanting to shoot down Zeppelins, so big airships. And the Zeppelins were taking off from I think the Netherlands, Belgium coast, that sort of area. And the idea was to take the submarine to get the float planes close enough that they could then intercept the Zeppelins close to the occupied shore. These float planes, pretty poor performing, I mean, modest for the day, of course. Um, they were single seaters and basically fighter aircraft, but very slow because of these massive floats. Again, Britain only did this once and it didn't really work very well. It's still experimental. And that's the story for World War One. Two people tried it, British, Germans. No one really took it, thought it was a winner. But after the war, America joined the game also with an experimental submarine. So one of their submarines, S1, was modified to carry float plane. This is quite interesting. Here's the submarine before it was modified. You can see it's very narrow superstructure, very small submarine, typical of the time, to be honest. But it was modified to look like this with a hangar and a float plane. Now, the makeover was actually quite extreme. If you look the same photograph left and right, you might not even recognize it's the same submarine. They've changed a lot of stuff, as well as adding the gun and increasing the size of the coning tower, of course. They've actually increased the size of the casing. That's the sort of decking on top of the submarine. See how much wider it is. And that was to accommodate a hangar behind the sail. So it's the first submarine with a hangar. Quite an interesting idea. You can see there a little aircraft in it. It's a tiny hangar, really. The aircraft is stored in kit form and has to be assembled after it's been brought out. The aircraft is this one. the Martin MS-1. It's a very nice looking little aeroplane. So, as close to cute as you could say for a plane. Noticed the three cylinder engine, pretty cool in itself. There was actually two designs. Um, this is the XS1. It looks almost identical. The only material difference, apart from being made by a different company, is that this was all metal, whereas the other one was fabric and wood. They were tried for a while, but it didn't really take off. And 1926, they even removed the hangar, gave up, it's done. But the next year, again, the Royal Navy says, hey, let's go back to this topic. And they made an even more substantial modified submarine to carry an aircraft. And with the hangar, like the American one, it could submerge with the aircraft, provided the aircraft is in the hangar, of course. The submarine was actually this one. Um, it's launched at the end of the war. It had a ginormous battleship gun, literally taken from a battleship. It was a monitor submarine. Again, I should do a video on this. It's a fascinating submarine. But after the war, it was modified to carry an aircraft, and the hangar was mounted forward of the sail where the gun would be. Um, and you can see it has a large crane. That's not a gun on top. The aircraft is slightly bigger, two-person scout aircraft. Notice that the door of the hangar is sort of square. That is not normal on submarines. It's not generally considered a good idea. As you know, circular things um, resist water pressure a bit better than square things. And unfortunately, this submarine, it was used a bit as an experimental submarine, but it didn't last long. It sunk, and sadly, it took the whole crew with it. When they investigated, they found that the hangar door was open. It appears that it submerged without closing the hangar, although we don't know the exact circumstances. The hangar is on the hangar door is on the right hand side of this image. It looks, visually, it looks like you see a gaping hole where the hangar door is, but that's actually the sail at the back, the hangar's at the front. Still a very illuminating sonar image. Let's get serious though. After all that experimentation, we start to see in the 1920s, late 1920s, we start to see submarines that are actually designed to carry aircraft, and the aircraft aren't just an experiment, they are part of its warfighting capability. The first submarine and the big deal is the Surcouf. This is a French submarine. At the time it was built, it's the largest submarine in the world, certainly the most impressive submarine. I think if anyone's got a top 10 most impressive or most capable submarines of all time, this is there in one of the greats. It's in anyone's list. Fascinating submarine, again designed around guns. The guns are quite important, actually. It was so powerful that they had to adjust the London Treaty to to allow it to exist. Other submarines were not allowed to be built that were as large or powerful as this. So the aircraft was carried in a hangar behind the sail. Um, it again is a small two-seat. It's a monoplane, but still, looks World War One like aircraft. Interestingly, the tail is sort of upside down. The lower vertical stabilizer is much larger than the upper one. The trick here, the reason it carried an aircraft was to increase the range of the guns or the effective range. Without without the aircraft, the guns could only fire as far as the sighting system could see, and that was about 16 kilometers. But these massive guns were able to fire a full 26 kilometers. That's almost twice as far if they had the aircraft in the air to do the spotting. So say, adjust your fire left a bit, right a bit, so on. So it increased the range of the guns. That was the big deal. There was actually another even more advanced concept of aircraft that was going to fit in that hangar. It's sort of called a gyro plane. It's like a basic early helicopter. You can see how beautiful it looks. On the right is the one that actually flew. Not quite so beautiful. Fascinating idea, big what if, but World War II got in the way, and this aircraft never joined the submarine. The submarine actually had a troubled story in World War II. I think Lindy Page did a video not so long ago about what happened when the Vichy French um, were had the submarine and the Royal Navy took it over. It was actually then it escaped from Germany. It's rather from German forces, it escaped France. It ended up being part of the Free French and was lost in mysterious circumstances in 1942 in the Caribbean. Most likely answer is that it was hit by a merchant ship, but there's lots of, it's lots to play for there. I don't think, as far as I remember, the wreck has not yet been found. Beautiful submarine, carried an aircraft. Um, let's see who's next. The big country for aircraft carrying submarines is not France, though. They only built one. It's Japan. Japan built a whole series of cruiser submarines starting in the 1920s, and it added aircraft to them, more for scouting. So it actually built 42 submarines that carried aircraft. Um, yeah, more than anyone else by a long shot. Um, I'm not going to go through every single design, but I'll give you an overview of the main significant design features and so on. And we will, of course, spend a little bit more time on the last one, the I-400. So the early submarines had two hangars. So the aircraft was stored in kit form, broken down into two parts on the left and right, or port and starboard. You can see one of the hangars here. Pretty hard to find photos of them, to be honest. Very low profile, very sleek, not very convenient. It must have been a real pain to get the aircraft out and to assemble it and disassemble it to put it back. So it was modified for a sort of slightly larger hangar forward, and you'll see also that ahead of the hangar there's sort of like a launch ramp, a catapult. That is pretty low profile because it's semi recessed into the casing. The actual hangar is bigger than it looks above the casing. There it is. And it was carrying an aircraft that was pretty similar to the ones that the earlier types were carrying, initially an E6Y1. Over time, these aircraft are getting a little bit bigger, a little bit more capable, but it still looks pretty much the same. And this aircraft, interesting, was unarmed. It was just a scout plane. But it was replaced by World War II, or during World War II, with the Glen, which was a more recognizable, more modern, if still slow, um, float plane and used for general reconnaissance and light bombing. It could carry a couple of small bombs, had a machine gun, that sort of thing. It wasn't so successful. Um, it's not. It's hard to really pick apart the reports, certainly that I've seen, as to how useful the aircraft was. But as an indication, in the later war, more emphasis was put on human torpedoes or Kai-10, sort of suicide submarines that had a big warhead in the front. Submarines like the I-36, which carried the aircraft, could carry about four of these. But if you remove the hangar, they could carry another couple forward, and that's what's happened here. So the hangar on I-36 was removed to make space for more Kai-10. I think that's indicative of the relative value that the aircraft ended up having. However, it doesn't stop there. We'll touch on the last of Japan's aircraft carrying submarines. This is another one like the Surcouf on anyone's list of the top 10 submarines of all time. It's got to be up there. The I-400. What's different here? We've progressed from, if you think back, World War One and after World War One, very much experimental. Then with Surcouf and the Japanese submarines, we start seeing aircraft as part of the capability, but they're there to spot targets or to adjust the fire of the guns. The I-400, the aircraft becomes the main offensive weapon. It is an aircraft carrier that can submerge. So here's the submarine. There's three of them in this photo on the left, and you can see how much bigger they are than other submarines. On the right, looking like a small boat, that is actually an American submarine of World War II, a fleet class, so ocean-going submarine, very big for submarines at the time, nothing compared to the I-400. They were ginormous. They were the biggest submarines in the world by a long way. Also, if you look at the third one across, you'll see that the shape of the casing is a little bit different. I'm curious as to why that is. I think some more research is needed on that. So, so these submarines are very impressive. What underneath what allowed them to be so large was that they were like a double hull in the sense of sort of like a figure eight or a double bubble, perhaps is a better way of saying it. So instead of just having a single round pressure hull, you had two that was sliced off and joined together like a figure eight. The hangar was sitting above them, and it was just offset slightly to starboard. So the right hand image blueprints are looking forward, and it's off to the right. Here's another view that shows it. This is from on top of the hangar, one of the anti-aircraft guns, and you can see the ramp for the float planes. It is just off to the right slightly, to the starboard. Okay. That allowed for the sail or coning tower, as it be called then, to be offset to the pool. And you can see um, that it sort of sticks out a bit on what would be the submarine's left hand side. Also, if you look, you can see sort of a bulge in the sail. That is another pressure hull. That's the coning tower, where command of the submarine is done from. These hangars were massive compared to other ones. This is after it was captured by the US at the end of the war. Guy looking in it, it's ginormous. Inside it were three of this much more capable aircraft. It's just, you can see, much more modern, sleek, powerful than the float planes in other types. It's pretty well armed. It could carry a torpedo, but it could also carry either two 250 kilogram or 185 sorry, 108, sorry, 850, apologies, kilogram bomb. So it could start bombing stuff basically, and the each submarine carried three of them. Why did they want them? Well, the mission became all about attacking the Panama Canal, which is about 8,000 nautical miles from Japan, depending, exactly what route you take, of course. But if you look at a canal, every lock gate is a single point of failure. If you can destroy a lock gate, then the canal doesn't function. So the idea was to go and bomb the lock gate and prevent America moving ships, particularly warships like this battleship that you can see on the left, between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Pretty strategic mission. Never got to play out, of course, because the war ended before they could conduct their mission. The Americans, when they discovered this, were a bit surprised. Submarines were studied for a while, but actually, and a bit sadly, none were preserved. Instead, they were sunk to prevent the Russians from getting hold of them. The Soviet Union was entitled to some of the spoils of war, some of the technologies that were captured in Japan. It was these submarines were so capable and so um, uh, potentially inspiring that they were kept secret from the Russians. They were sunk, supposedly by accident, of course, not the case. Before I go post-war, I actually should have covered this. I said I was going to do it chronologically, but um, obviously I think it's good to do the Japanese ones together. The Germans also experimented with launching aircraft from submarines in World War II, but a very different type of game. They basically had a gyro kite, so it looks like a helicopter, but it's got no engine. It relies on forward being pulled, towed essentially, so the forward momentum from the submarine to generate lift. Single crew, it was stored on the external to the submarine in kit form, and you had to get it out of these containers, assemble it well, like an IKEA bicycle or something, and up it goes. Not very capable, not a great idea, but at least if you're in it, you have a much better, much longer visual horizon. If you're in this aircraft and the submarine, there's suddenly a threat, you see a threat, so you can see further, you see some fighter planes or bomber, whatever. If the submarine's going to dive, you're done for. Yeah, getting you down inside the submarine, the kite folded up and everything, and then submerged, much too late. Not a great idea. Quite interesting. Let's go Cold War. So I mentioned that America got the I-400. You can see at the top there. One of the things they did in the post-war years was start to copy it. And down below, you have the concept of a submarine, that's a US sketch of basically an American I-400 post-war. What they actually built wasn't quite that. It was slightly more modest, but there was a whole series of submarines designed to launch the Regulus missile. And the Regulus, although it's a missile, it is aircraft shaped and operates much like an aircraft. So if you can launch this, you can launch a plane that basically this with a person in it. You can see that there's two versions. The initial Regulus sort of has a rounded nose. It's actually an air intake in the nose, so blunt, let's say. And the one on the right, bottom right, Regulus 2, very pointy. The most advanced of these designs was going to be the Permit class. USS Permit almost got built, would have four of those Regulus 2 uh, missiles. This is my cutaway. Find it on my website, of course. But quite an interesting submarine. They also experimented with this, the AN-1 submarine aircraft carrier. This is much bigger, and you'll notice that the the missiles are replaced by aircraft. As I said, the if you can launch a missile, you can launch a plane. And there was a few different designs. One of the most plausible, I think, was to take the Grumman F-11F Tiger, which was a pretty decent fighter, and um, in its later, future versions could have been uh, really impressive design. But that's a case for another story. And to add sort of like a launch kit that gives it more power, so you can launch it vertically or on a slope. Main idea was tail sitters, vertical, and you probably know that in the 1950s there was a lot of experimentation with tail sitting aircraft, launch vertical, land on the tail. Douglas also had another idea, the Douglas Model 640, see it on left here. That is going to operate exactly the same, it's just a different design. Is actually quite closely related to the A-Force Skyhawk. And of course, being the 1950s, there was a Mach 2, Mach 3 version of this. And this is what we saw in some earlier graphics, the exact same launch system, but a much faster fighter. The reason you don't actually hear about these ever getting built, they weren't, was partly because it's a bad idea, but more so nuclear submarines really revolutionized not just what submarines are capable of, but how they could be employed. And this is the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine launched in 1954. It became almost immediately apparent that this was the way forward. And with a nuclear submarine, you don't have to surface. You can sail as long as the crew can survive, as long as you've got food for, basically. And a submarine's advantage is that it's submerged. The last thing you want to do is surface and launch aircraft. The aircraft also were nowhere near as powerful, and this goes for even the Regulus missile with their nuclear warhead, nowhere near as powerful as missiles that could be launched from a submarine in sort of like ballistic missile submarines that we know today. And so aircraft submarines, once you have these capabilities, nuclear submarines, ballistic missiles like Polaris, nah, no need for them. It's not quite the end. There was about the same time a lot of development in seaplanes, and there's some really impressive seaplanes. So post-war seaplanes, again, I think there's some good videos, but an interesting topic in itself. One idea was to use submarines to refuel them, and you see that happening here. Was not a huge thing, and seaplanes fell out of favor as well. They were one of the losers. The invention of these nuclear submarines now took away from seaplanes. We do see helicopters as they become more capable starting to be used in conjunction with submarines, mainly for ferrying crew to and from them. But the submarines weren't carrying the helicopters as such. One thing I should mention, this is the only photos I have of it clearly. This is from a declassified CIA document. Clearly, someone photocopied it at a time in the day. But they were launching spy balloons from submarines. Really interesting story. Its own. I think I've got right up on my website. You can see here 1955, the launch of a balloon. more recently, of course, China is launching big balloons. You remember one that flew over America and got shot down and stuff like this. This is the same game. It was done a lot in the 1950s, smaller balloons. They were lot were launched from land, but the idea was to launch them from a submarine surface, launch a balloon, submerge. The balloon takes photographs of sensitive targets. It became very politically sensitive with overflights. Gary Powers getting shot down in a U-2 aircraft, of course, that sort of thing. It was stopped. It was just too provocative. Should wrap up mentioning some silly ideas. I don't think these deserve the attention they get. Very exciting and interesting. I really not convinced they would have worked. Certainly the one on the left. Um, yeah, I'll leave that to what's up, people. Sorry, what's up? What if people? Yeah, this is unscripted, in case you hadn't guessed. Right. Also should mention there were some really cool ideas in the 80s, people, especially British people, interested in Harrier jump jets and how they could be used. Oh, put them on submarine. Never a serious proposal. There was no way the Royal Navy was ever going to build this. Again, notice the square hangar door. Not a great idea, but brilliant photograph, lovely idea. Skyhooks are cool. Nowadays, we see drones being used from submarines. I don't think we're ever going to see a crewed submarine with crewed aircraft. It just isn't going to happen. But we will start to see submarines launching more and more drones. This is the Iranian one launching a little drone, pretty sensible. Um, they got a couple of drones on the submarine here, but we'll of course see much more integrated platforms. And there have been many designs in recent years on this. We'll see it more and more. Okay, I'm pretty exhausted. If you like, let's get it out there. If you like it, please like, subscribe, usual stuff. Thank you.